Baby saw a bear cub, hidden in a comic book store. Back issue room. What he did next was super. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of Marshall's Comics, casting long golden streaks across rows and rows of colorful covers. Jessica Brooks pushed through the heavy glass door with her shoulder, balancing her 18-month-old son Connor on her hip while juggling her purse and a half-empty bottle of formula. The bell above the door chimed softly, a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have in the quiet store. Connor's chubby fingers immediately reached toward the nearest display, his eyes wide with fascination at all the bright colors and mysterious figures staring back at him from glossy covers. Jessica had come here looking for a birthday gift for her nephew, but something about this particular afternoon felt different from the moment she stepped inside. The air itself seemed to hum with a strange energy, like the static before a storm, though the sky outside remained perfectly clear. Ethan Marshall looked up from behind the counter where he'd been cataloging a new shipment of vintage issues, his reading glasses perched precariously on the tip of his nose. He'd owned this shop for 15 years, knew every corner, every creaky floorboard, every peculiar smell that came with old paper and printer's ink. But today, something was off. He'd been feeling it since morning, a peculiar tingling at the base of his skull, like someone was watching him from just beyond his peripheral vision. When he saw the young mother with her baby enter, he forced a welcoming smile, though his eyes kept darting toward the back of the store, toward the door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" that led to the back issue room. That door had been locked for 3 days now, ever since he'd heard those strange, scratching sounds coming from behind it. He'd meant to investigate, but something always stopped him, some inexplicable reluctance that made his hand shake whenever he reached for the key. Jessica noticed the owner's distracted demeanor, but attributed it to the typical eccentricity of comic book shop proprietors. She'd met enough of them while shopping for her nephew over the years. Connor squirmed in her arms, making soft babbling sounds that almost seemed like he was trying to communicate something important. His little hands kept pointing toward the back of the store, toward that restricted door, and each time he did, Jessica felt an odd chill run down her spine. She tried to focus on the task at hand, browsing through the new releases section, but Connor's increasing agitation made it difficult. He wasn't crying exactly, but making these urgent little sounds, almost like he was trying to tell her something crucial. His eyes remained fixed on that door, and Jessica found herself staring at it too, wondering what could possibly be so interesting about a storage room. The scratching sound came first, so soft that both adults almost missed it. It was like fingernails on cardboard, but gentler, more deliberate. Ethan's head snapped up, his comic book falling from his hands and landing with a soft thud on the floor. Jessica froze, Connor suddenly going completely silent in her arms. The scratching came again, this time accompanied by something else, something that made no sense at all. It sounded like purring, but not quite. It was deeper, more resonant, like the purr of something much larger than any house cat. Connor's face broke into an enormous grin, and before Jessica could react, he'd wiggled free from her grip with surprising strength and speed. Her heart leaped into her throat as she watched her baby toddle determinedly toward that forbidden door, his little legs moving faster than she'd ever seen them move before. Everything happened so quickly after that. The door, which Ethan swore he'd locked, swung open just as Connor reached it. Not violently, but slowly, deliberately, as if something on the other side had been waiting for exactly this moment. Jessica lunged forward. Ethan vaulted over the counter, but Connor had already disappeared into the darkness beyond. The back issue room had no windows, and the single overhead bulb had burned out weeks ago. Ethan had been meaning to replace it, but now, As he and Jessica rushed through the doorway after the baby, they discovered the room wasn't dark at all. It was glowing with a soft bluish light that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air smelled different here, not like old paper and dust, but like rain on summer grass, like the ocean at dawn, like things that had no business being in a comic book store's storage room. Connor stood in the center of the room, his tiny figure illuminated by that strange light. And he wasn't alone. Next to him, no taller than the toddler himself, sat what looked like a bear cub. But as Jessica's eyes adjusted to the peculiar lighting, she realized this was no ordinary animal. Its fur seemed to shimmer and shift, one moment appearing solid and brown, the next translucent and filled with what looked like tiny stars. The creature's eyes were the most striking feature, large and luminous, containing depths that seemed to go on forever. They weren't the eyes of an animal at all, but something far more ancient, far more knowing. Connor had his small hand placed gently on the creature's head, and both baby and being were making the same soft, musical sound, a harmony that made Jessica's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. Ethan's first instinct was to grab the child, to pull him away from potential danger, but something in the creature's posture stopped him. It wasn't threatening at all. In fact, it looked almost sad, lonely even, like it had been waiting here in the dark for someone, anyone, to find it. The way it leaned into Connor's touch, the way its strange, shifting fur seemed to brighten at the baby's presence, spoke of a deep need for connection. Jessica found herself moving forward slowly, not in fear, but in wonder. She'd expected to feel terrified, protective, but instead she felt an overwhelming sense of peace washing over her. The creature looked up at her with those impossible eyes, and she could have sworn she saw recognition there, as if it knew exactly who she was, who Connor was, why they had come here today. The room around them began to reveal itself in that blue glow. Stacks upon stacks of old comics lined the walls, some in protective plastic, others loose and yellowing with age. But there was something else too, something that made Ethan gasp audibly. On the floor around the creature, arranged in a perfect circle, were comic books he'd never seen before. Their covers depicted scenes that seemed to move and shift like the creature's fur, showing landscapes that couldn't exist on Earth, heroes whose faces changed depending on the angle you viewed them from. One comic lay open beside the creature, its pages glowing brighter than the rest, and on those pages was an image that made all three humans freeze in place. It showed a small child. Unmistakably Connor, despite being drawn in comic book style, standing beside the exact same shimmering creature, both of them surrounded by stars. Connor giggled, a sound of pure joy that echoed strangely in the room, seeming to bounce off surfaces that shouldn't exist in a space this small. The creature responded with its own sound, not quite a growl, not quite a purr, but something musical and deeply comforting. It stood up on legs that seemed too graceful for a bear cub, too fluid, as if the normal rules of anatomy didn't quite apply to it. Jessica noticed then that where its paws touched the floor, the concrete seemed to ripple like water, leaving behind faint glowing footprints that faded after a few seconds. The creature walked slowly around Connor, not in a predatory way, but almost like it was examining him, confirming something it already suspected. Connor turned with it, maintaining that gentle contact, his baby babble taking on an almost conversational tone. Ethan found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. He asked what it was, where it had come from, though he wasn't really expecting an answer. The creature turned those deep, star-filled eyes toward him, and suddenly Ethan's mind was filled with images that weren't his own. He saw vast spaces between stars, colors that had no names, worlds where beings like this one lived in harmony with the cosmos itself. He saw loneliness too, a profound isolation that came from being accidentally separated from one's own kind. The images came so fast, so vivid, that Ethan had to grab the doorframe to steady himself. When the flood of visions stopped, he found tears streaming down his face, though he couldn't say whether they were from sadness or wonder, or both. Jessica had received the same download of images, the same overwhelming sense of the creature's story. She understood now that it wasn't dangerous, had never been dangerous. It was lost, had been lost for so long it had almost forgotten what home felt like. Somehow, it had found its way here, to this most unlikely of places, drawn perhaps by the stories themselves, by the comics that spoke of heroes and adventures and beings from other worlds. It had been hiding here, feeding off the creative energy that permeated the store, waiting for someone who could see it for what it really was. And Connor, with his innocent eyes and pure heart, had been exactly what it was waiting for. Babies, Jessica realized with a start, could see things adults had trained themselves to ignore, could accept the impossible without question. The creature made a gesture then, a surprisingly human movement of its paw toward the open comic book on the floor. Ethan knelt beside it, careful not to make any sudden movements, and examined the pages more closely. The artwork was unlike anything he'd ever seen, seeming to shift and breathe on the page. The story it told was simple but profound. It showed the creature's kind, beings of pure energy that could take physical form when needed, who traveled between dimensions collecting stories, preserving them in ways humans couldn't understand. This one had been young by their standards, curious and adventurous, and had gotten separated from its family during what the images suggested was some kind of cosmic storm. It had been bouncing between realities, searching for its way home, growing weaker with each jump. Connor sat down cross-legged beside the creature, a position Jessica had never seen him manage before. His motor skills seemed enhanced in its presence, his movements more coordinated. He reached for the comic book, and the creature gently pushed it toward him with its snout. As Connor's fingers touched the pages, they began to glow brighter, and new images appeared. These showed Connor himself, older, maybe 5 or 6 years old, standing in what looked like the same comic shop, but somehow different, transformed. The walls were covered in artwork that moved and lived, and beside him stood not just this creature but others like it, a whole family of star bears, as Jessica had begun to think of them. The images showed Connor acting as some kind of bridge, helping these beings find their way home, while they, in turn, brought wonder and magic into his world. The implication was clear but impossible. The creature wasn't just lost, it was offering something, proposing a connection that would last years. Jessica's maternal instincts should have kicked in, should have made her grab Connor and run, but instead she found herself considering it. There was something so pure about the creature's intentions, so genuinely benevolent, that fear seemed impossible. She looked at Ethan, expecting to see skepticism or alarm on his face, but instead found wonder mixed with a deep understanding. He'd been around stories his whole life, had built his career on them, and he recognized truth when he saw it, even when that truth was impossible. The creature stood again and walked to a corner of the room Jessica hadn't noticed before. There, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, was something that made her breath catch. It was a nest of sorts, made from shredded comic books, but not destroyed ones. The pages had been carefully selected, showing only scenes of families, of reunions, of love and connection. The creature had been trying to remember what home felt like by surrounding itself with these images. Among the nest materials, something glowed with a different light, warmer, more golden. It was a small object, no bigger than a marble, that seemed to contain an entire galaxy within its transparent surface. The creature picked it up delicately in its mouth and brought it to Connor, placing it in the baby's outstretched palm. The moment Connor touched the object, the room filled with warmth. Not heat, but the kind of warmth that came from being held by someone who loved you, from being safe and protected and cherished. Jessica felt it wash over her, through her, and suddenly she could hear something she'd never heard before. It was like music, but not quite, more like the universe itself was humming a lullaby. Connor laughed, a sound of such pure delight that both adults found themselves smiling despite the strangeness of it all. The creature made its own sound of joy, and for a moment, just a moment, its form solidified completely. It looked like a real bear cub then, soft and brown and utterly huggable, before shifting back to its star-filled state. Ethan realized with a start that he'd been in this room for what felt like hours, but when he glanced at his watch, only minutes had passed. Time moved differently around the creature, he understood, not faster or slower, but sideways somehow. He thought about all the strange things he'd experienced since opening this shop, all the customers who'd told him stories about impossible things, all the times he'd felt like the comics were more than just stories. This creature, this moment, felt like a confirmation of everything he'd always suspected, but never dared to believe. The universe was vast and strange and wonderful, and sometimes, just sometimes, it leaked into ordinary places like comic book shops in small towns. The creature began to move around the room, touching various comics with its snout, and each one it touched began to glow faintly. Ethan recognized a pattern in its selections. They were all first issues, all origin stories, all tales of beginnings and discoveries. The creature was trying to tell them something about starts, about how every story had to begin somewhere, even impossible ones. It paused at one particular comic, an old issue of Amazing Fantasy, the one that had introduced Spider-Man to the world. The creature stared at it for a long moment, then looked back at Connor, and Jessica understood. Great power and great responsibility. The creature was offering Connor something powerful, but it came with responsibility too, the responsibility to keep the secret, to protect the magic, to be a guardian of wonder in a world that had forgotten how to believe. Connor stood up, still clutching the galaxy marble, and toddled over to the creature. He wrapped his small arms around its neck, and the creature leaned into the embrace. The glow in the room intensified, and for a moment Jessica could see through the walls themselves, could see the entire shop, the street outside, the town, all of it overlaid with threads of light that connected everything to everything else. She saw how the creature's presence had been affecting things, making people more creative, more willing to believe in the impossible. She saw children in the neighborhood having vivid dreams of adventure, adults remembering what it felt like to imagine, artists finding inspiration in the mundane. The creature hadn't just been hiding here. It had been healing something in the community, something that had been broken without anyone realizing it. But the creature was growing weaker. Jessica could see it now in the way its form flickered occasionally, the way the stars in its fur seemed dimmer than they had just minutes ago. It needed to go home, needed to find its family, but it didn't know how. The comics had been sustaining it, the stories giving it just enough energy to survive, but it wasn't enough. It needed something more, something that Connor seemed to instinctively understand. The baby pulled back from the hug and held up the galaxy marble, offering it back to the creature. But instead of taking it, The creature gently pushed Connor's hand back, then gestured toward the open comic on the floor. Ethan understood first. The creature wanted them to add to the story, to complete it somehow. He grabbed a pencil from his pocket, one he always carried for making notes on inventory, and knelt beside the comic. But when he touched the pencil to the page, nothing happened. The creature shook its head gently, then looked at Connor. Of course, Ethan thought. It had to be Connor. The baby had been the key from the beginning. Jessica lifted her son, bringing him close to the comic, and Connor, with that strange enhanced coordination he'd displayed since entering the room, took the pencil from Ethan's hand. He shouldn't have been able to hold it properly, shouldn't have been able to make any meaningful marks, but as the pencil touched the page, it began to move on its own, guided by Connor's intent rather than his motor skills. The drawing that emerged was simple but perfect. It showed the creature surrounded by others like it, a family of star bears in a place that looked like the inside of a nebula. They were all glowing, all happy, all together. As the last line was completed, the comic book itself began to glow, and the creature made a sound that was unmistakably grateful. It touched its snout to the page, and suddenly the drawn figures began to move, began to reach out from the page itself. The creature looked back at Connor one last time, those impossible eyes full of promise, full of assurance that this wasn't goodbye, not really. Then it stepped forward, into the page, into the drawing, becoming two-dimensional for just a moment before disappearing entirely. The room went dark. Not completely, but the strange blue glow faded, leaving only the dim light filtering in from the main shop. The comics that had been glowing were just comics again, the impossible circle on the floor just a random arrangement. But the galaxy marble in Connor's hand still pulsed with warm light, and the comic book, the one Connor had drawn in, remained on the floor, its pages now showing new artwork that hadn't been there before. It told the complete story of the creature's visit, their encounter, and its return home. But the last page, Jessica noticed with a mix of worry and wonder, showed the creature coming back. Older, stronger, with others of its kind returning to the shop that had sheltered it, to the boy who had saved it. Ethan picked up the comic carefully, reverently, and noticed something else. There was writing on the back cover, in a language that shouldn't exist, but that all three of them could somehow read. It said simply, "When wonder fades, when magic dims, when the world forgets how to dream, we shall return. The door is open, the story continues." He looked at Jessica, who was holding Connor close, the baby now drowsy as if the encounter had exhausted him. They both understood that something had fundamentally changed, not just in their lives, but in the very fabric of reality around this little comic shop. The creature had left, but it had left something behind, a connection, a promise, a responsibility. Jessica asked Ethan if he believed what had just happened, if he thought they should tell anyone. Ethan laughed, but it wasn't a dismissive laugh. It was the laugh of someone who'd just discovered that the universe was far more interesting than he'd ever imagined. He said that no one would believe them anyway, and maybe that was for the best. Some stories were meant to be kept secret, at least for a while. He looked at the comic in his hands, then at Connor, who was now sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, still clutching the galaxy marble. He suggested that maybe Connor should keep coming to the shop, that maybe there were more stories to discover, more mysteries to unravel. Jessica agreed, understanding that her son had been chosen for something, marked by an encounter that would shape his entire life. As they walked back into the main shop, everything looked the same but felt different. The comics on the shelves seemed more vibrant, their stories more alive. Ethan went to lock the back room door, but found it already locked. as if it had never been opened at all. The only evidence of what had happened was the comic in his hands and the marble in Connor's. Jessica asked if she should still buy something for her nephew, trying to return to normalcy, and Ethan laughed again. He pulled a comic from the shelf, one he'd been saving, a first edition of something special, and handed it to her. He said it was on the house that after what they'd shared, they were family now, bound by a secret that was also a gift. Over the following weeks, things in the shop began to change in subtle ways. Customers would come in feeling tired or sad and leave energized, inspired. Children would spend hours just sitting and reading, their imaginations firing in ways that surprised their parents. Artists and writers began gathering there, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Ethan noticed that certain comics would glow faintly when Connor visited, which was often now. Jessica had made it part of their routine, understanding that her son needed to be here, needed to be close to where it had happened, and Connor, despite being so young, seemed to understand too. He would toddle to that back door and place his hand on it, and sometimes, just sometimes, they could hear that purring sound from the other side. The Galaxy marble became Connor's most treasured possession. Jessica tried to take it once, worried about him swallowing it, but it always found its way back to him. It would appear in his crib, in his pocket, in his tiny hand, when she was sure she'd hidden it away. Eventually, she stopped trying. The marble never seemed dangerous, and Connor was careful with it in a way that babies usually weren't with small objects. He would hold it up to the light and giggle at the swirling galaxies within, and sometimes Jessica could swear she saw movement in there, saw the star bears playing in their cosmic home. Ethan started documenting everything, keeping a journal of the strange occurrences in the shop. He noticed patterns, times when the energy was stronger, when the comics seemed most alive. It always coincided with Connor's visits, as if the baby was a conduit for whatever magic the creature had left behind. He began setting aside special comics, ones that seemed to resonate with that energy, keeping them in the back room, which now felt less like a storage space and more like a shrine to wonder. He would sit there sometimes, after closing, and just feel the residual magic, the promise that there was more to come. One evening, about a month after the encounter, something new happened. Connor was in the shop with Jessica, playing on the floor with some toy cars Ethan kept for young visitors, when suddenly he stood up and walked to a particular shelf. He reached for a comic he shouldn't have been able to reach, and it seemed to float down to his hands. When Jessica and Ethan looked at it, they gasped. It was a comic neither of them had seen before, one that shouldn't exist. On the cover was Connor himself, older, maybe 10 years old, standing in what looked like the shop but transformed, filled with light and impossible architecture. Beside him stood not just one star bear but 3, and in the background, through what looked like a window that opened onto space itself, more creatures waited. The comic's title read, The Guardian of Stories, Issue Number 1, and the publication date was 7 years in the future. When Ethan opened it carefully, the pages were blank except for the first one, which showed the scene they were living right now. Connor finding the comic, their shocked faces, the shop around them. As they watched, words began to appear on the page, describing exactly what was happening, their thoughts, their feelings, the way the light was falling through the windows. The comic was writing itself, documenting their story as they lived it. Jessica felt a chill run through her, not of fear, but of recognition. This was bigger than just one lost creature. This was the beginning of something vast and strange and wonderful. Connor seemed unsurprised by the self-writing comic. He patted it gently, like greeting an old friend, then went back to his toys. But Jessica and Ethan couldn't look away from the pages as they continued to fill with words and images. The story being told was their story, but also more than that. It showed the threads connecting them to other people, other places, other impossible encounters happening all over the world. The Star Bears weren't the only beings that had gotten lost, weren't the only ones seeking connection with humanity. The comic showed glimpses of other children finding other creatures, each encounter opening a door that had been closed for too long. As the weeks turned to months, the shop became a beacon for the unusual. People would come in with stories of strange dreams, of seeing things that couldn't be there, of feeling like the world was bigger than they'd thought. Ethan became a keeper of these stories, documenting them, finding connections. He discovered that many of them had been in the shop on that day, had been touched by the creature's presence even without seeing it. The effect was spreading, rippling out from that single encounter, awakening something in the community that had been sleeping for generations. Children drew pictures of impossible things that turned out to be true. Adults remembered dreams from childhood that suddenly made sense. And everyone who entered the shop felt a little bit of that magic. Connor grew, faster than normal in some ways, slower in others. His verbal skills developed early, but his first real word wasn't mama or dada, but something that sounded like the name of a distant star. He would have conversations with empty air that Jessica gradually realized weren't with empty air at all. The galaxy marble would glow during these conversations, and sometimes she could almost see shapes in the light, hints of the creatures Connor was talking to. She worried at first, wondered if she should be concerned, but Connor was so happy, so healthy, so obviously thriving that she let it continue. Whatever was happening, it was good for him, was part of him in a way that couldn't be separated. The self-writing comic continued to fill itself, page by page, day by day. Ethan kept it in a special case in the back room, and only he, Jessica, and Connor ever looked at it. It showed not just their story, but the story of the Star Bears, their history, their purpose. They were collectors and protectors of stories, beings that existed to ensure that wonder never died completely in any universe. The one that had visited them had been young, on its first solo mission, and getting lost had been part of its journey, part of how it learned. Its family had been watching all along, unable to intervene but knowing it would find its way. And Connor, the comic revealed, had been chosen long before he was born, marked as someone who could bridge worlds, who could help these beings in their vital work. Sometimes, late at night, when the shop was closed and the streets were quiet, Ethan would hear music coming from the back room. Not Earth music, but something else, something that made his chest ache with beauty and longing. He would find Connor there, having somehow transported himself from his crib at home, sitting in the middle of that circle of comics, the galaxy marble floating above his palm, projecting images of distant worlds and impossible creatures. Jessica would arrive minutes later, having woken to find Connor gone, but she was never angry, never scared. She understood that this was part of who Connor was now, part of what he was becoming. The Star Bears family sent messages through the marble sometimes, images and feelings rather than words. They showed Connor things he would need to know, taught him in ways that bypassed normal learning. By the time he was 2, he could read, not just English, but symbols and languages that had no earthly origin. He would trace patterns in the air that Ethan recognized from theoretical physics papers, from equations that described the shape of space-time itself. But he was still a child, still played with toys, and laughed at silly faces and needed naps and snacks. The cosmic and the mundane existed side by side in him, neither canceling out the other. Other children began to be drawn to the shop, children who were different in subtle ways. Some could see colors that didn't have names. Others heard music in mathematical patterns. Still others knew things they shouldn't know about places they'd never been. They would gather around Connor, and he would show them the galaxy marble, and their own gifts would suddenly make sense. Parents initially worried, but when they saw how happy their children were, how confident and creative they became, they stopped questioning it. The shop became a haven for the extraordinary hidden in the ordinary, a place where impossible things were possible, and no one had to pretend to be less than they were. Ethan's business had never been better, but it wasn't really about the comics anymore. People came for the feeling, for the sense that anything could happen, that stories weren't just entertainment but doorways. He hired help, a young woman named Lily Morgan, who'd walked in one day claiming she'd been dreaming about the shop for months before finding it. She could see the threads of light that connected the comics to each other, could recommend exactly the right story for each customer, the one that would unlock something in them. She and Connor developed an immediate bond, and Jessica realized with a start that Lily was like Connor, marked by something otherworldly, chosen for a purpose that was still revealing itself. The first anniversary of the encounter approached, and the shop hummed with anticipation. The self-writing comic had been hinting at something, showing images of a reunion, a return. Connor, now walking and talking with surprising sophistication for his age, told his mother that his friend was coming back, that it was bringing family. Jessica felt both excitement and apprehension. The first encounter had changed everything, had opened doors that couldn't be closed. What would a second encounter bring? Ethan prepared the back room, clearing space, setting up lights, making it ready for whatever was coming. The community seemed to sense something too, with more people than usual stopping by the shop, drawn by an instinct they couldn't name. The day arrived, a Tuesday that should have been ordinary but wasn't. The air itself felt different, charged with possibility. Connor had been awake since dawn, standing by the window, watching the sky. The galaxy marble orbited around him slowly, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Jessica and Ethan waited with him, along with Lily and a handful of others who'd become part of their strange family. They didn't know exactly when it would happen, but they knew it would. The self-writing comic had stopped adding pages 3 days ago, ending with an image of a door opening, light spilling through, and the single word, soon. It happened at sunset, the golden hour when the light was perfect and the world seemed to hold its breath. The back room door opened on its own, slowly, deliberately, and that familiar blue glow spilled out. But it was stronger now, more vibrant, and accompanied by that music Ethan had been hearing, now loud enough for everyone to hear. Connor walked forward without hesitation, the others following, and what they saw in that room made them all gasp in wonder. It wasn't just one star bear but 5, each one unique, each one beautiful in its own impossible way. The original visitor was there, larger now, more solid, its star-filled fur bright with health and happiness. It made that purring sound, and Connor ran to it, throwing his arms around its neck like greeting an old friend. The reunion was joyful but also purposeful. The Star Bears had come with a message, a proposal, an invitation. Through images and feelings and that strange music, they communicated their plan. The door between worlds that Connor had helped open needed guardians, needed people who could help lost beings find their way home, who could preserve and protect the stories that kept wonder alive. They were offering to teach Connor and others like him, to share their knowledge, to create a network of safe havens across the world. The comic shop would be the first, but not the last. A beacon that would help other beacons light up, creating a map of magic that spanned the globe. Jessica understood that this meant Connor's life would never be normal, that he would always be different, always be connected to something larger than the ordinary world. but looking at her son's face, seeing the joy and purpose there, she couldn't wish for anything else. This was who he was meant to be, what he was born for. The Star Bears showed them glimpses of the future, of Connor grown, working with beings from a dozen different dimensions, helping to weave stories that would keep the universe itself healthy and whole. It was a big responsibility for such a small child, but he wouldn't be alone. He would have family, both human and otherwise, and he would have the stories themselves, always the stories, connecting everything to everything else. The Star Bears stayed for hours, teaching, sharing, preparing them for what was to come. They showed Ethan how to modify the shop, how to create spaces that could accommodate visitors from other dimensions. They taught Lily how to read the threads of story that connected all things, how to find people who were ready to believe. They gave Jessica a smaller marble, one that would let her always know where Connor was, even when he traveled to places that didn't exist on any map. And to Connor, they gave the most precious gift of all, the knowledge that he was loved, that he was important, that his life had meaning beyond anything he could imagine. As midnight approached, the Star Bears prepared to leave, but this time it wasn't a goodbye. They showed Connor how to call them, how to open the door when it was needed. They promised to return, to check on him, to continue his education. The original visitor, the one Connor had saved, touched its snout to the boy's forehead, and for a moment Connor glowed with the same star-filled light as the creatures. Then, one by one, they walked back through the door, which closed gently behind them. The room returned to normal, just a storage space filled with old comics. But everyone who'd witnessed what happened knew it would never really be normal again. In the days that followed, changes began immediately. Other shop owners contacted Ethan, reporting strange occurrences, asking for advice. Children from around the world began drawing the same symbols Connor had been tracing in the air. Scientists detected anomalies they couldn't explain, patterns in cosmic radiation that looked almost like language. The world was waking up to wonder, slowly but surely, and it all traced back to a baby who'd wandered into a back room and made friends with an impossible creature. The self-writing comic began adding pages again, but now it wasn't just their story. It was the story of a transformation, of a world remembering how to believe in magic. Connor grew, surrounded by love and strangeness in equal measure. He went to school like any child, but came home to lessons no school could teach. He played on playgrounds and traveled through dimensions. He learned to read and write, and also to speak the language of stars. The Galaxy Marble became his constant companion, a reminder of that first encounter and a tool for all the encounters to come. Jessica watched her son navigate both worlds with grace, never losing his humanity even as he became something more than human. She understood now that this had always been his destiny, that every choice she'd made had led to that moment in the comic shop, to the meeting that changed everything. Ethan's shop became famous in certain circles, whispered about in online forums, sought out by those who felt the call of something beyond the ordinary, but it maintained its disguise as just a comic shop, just a place where stories were sold. Only those who were ready could see what it really was, could feel the magic humming in the walls. The back room remained locked to most, but sometimes, for the right person at the right time, it would open on its own, revealing wonders that defied explanation. And always at the center of it all was Connor, the bridge between worlds, the guardian of stories, the child who'd saved a Star Bear, and in doing so had saved something in humanity itself. Years passed, and Connor grew into his role. By the time he was 5, he could open doors to other dimensions as easily as opening a comic book. By 7, he was teaching other children what the Star Bears had taught him. By 10, He was everything the self-writing comic had shown he would be, and more. But he never lost his wonder, never became jaded by the impossible things he saw daily. Every encounter was still magical to him, every story still important. He understood what the Starbears had been trying to teach humanity all along, that stories weren't just entertainment, they were the threads that held reality together, the dreams that shaped what was possible. The shop remained the center of it all, a humble comic store that was also a nexus of dimensions, a library of impossible tales, a school for the extraordinary. Ethan grew old running it, but he never grew tired of the magic. Jessica watched her son become something legendary while still remaining her little boy. Lily became Connor's closest advisor, helping him navigate the increasingly complex network of story guardians they were building. And through it all, the Starbears visited, sometimes one, sometimes many, always bringing new knowledge, new connections, new reasons to believe in the impossible. The Galaxy Marble, Connor's first gift from the Starbears, never dimmed. If anything, it grew brighter over the years, fed by the stories it witnessed, the connections it facilitated. Connor would sometimes stare into it and see not just galaxies but entire narratives, the life stories of beings from across the universe. He learned that every star had a story, every planet a purpose, and that Earth's purpose was to be a keeper of tales, a place where stories from everywhere could be preserved and shared. Humanity's gift, the Starbears taught him, was the ability to imagine, to create new stories that had never existed before, and that gift was precious beyond measure. The other 2 chapters of Mentioned Part has completed. The comic shop stood at the corner of 5th and Main, looking no different from the day Jessica had first brought Connor there. But those who knew how to look could see the threads of light emanating from it, reaching out across the world, connecting to other places where wonder lived. They could see the children who gathered there, each one special in their own way, each one learning to be a guardian of something precious. They could see Ethan, older now but with eyes that sparkled with knowledge of impossible things. They could see Jessica, proud and protective, watching over not just Connor but all the children who'd become part of their extended family. And they could see Connor himself, no longer a baby, but still young, still full of joy at every new discovery, still the bridge between the ordinary and the extraordinary. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Connor stood in the back room with the latest group of children who'd found their way to the shop. He held up the Galaxy Marble, and it projected images of the Starbears' home, that place between spaces where stories lived and breathed. He told them what he'd learned over the years, that everyone had a story, that every story mattered, that the universe itself was just a story the cosmos was telling itself. He showed them how to see the connections, how to feel the threads that bound everything together. And when one little girl, no older than he had been at that first encounter, asked if the Starbears would come back, Connor smiled and said they never really left. They were in every story, every dream, every moment of wonder. As if in response to his words, the familiar blue glow began to emanate from the walls. The children gasped as shapes formed in the light, not quite solid, but definitely there. The Starbears had learned to visit without fully manifesting, to be present without needing physical form. They moved through the room like gentle ghosts, touching each child with light, leaving them with a sense of connection to something vast and beautiful. Connor watched with satisfaction, knowing that each of these children would go out into the world carrying a piece of this magic, spreading it further, keeping the wonder alive. The self-writing comic had grown into multiple volumes now, documenting not just Connor's story but the stories of all the Guardians, all the encounters, all the moments when the impossible became possible. Ethan kept them in a special climate-controlled case, knowing that someday they would be important historical documents, proof that magic had returned to the world. But for now, they were just part of the shop's collection, available to anyone who knew how to ask for them, who was ready to believe what they showed. Sometimes, late at night, when the shop was closed and the streets were quiet, Connor would sit alone in the back room and talk to the Star Bears across dimensions. They would tell him about other worlds they'd visited, other species they'd helped, other stories they'd preserved. They would show him the vast web of narrative that held the universe together and his place in it. He was no longer just a guardian but an architect, helping to build new connections, new possibilities. The child who'd wandered into a back room had become something unprecedented, a human who could think like a Star Bear, who could see stories the way they saw them, as living things that shaped reality itself. But with all his cosmic responsibilities, Connor never forgot the simple joy of that first encounter. He kept a picture on his wall, drawn by a local artist who'd somehow captured the moment perfectly despite not being there. It showed a baby reaching out to touch a creature made of stars, both of them glowing with the same light, both of them smiling. It reminded him that all the vast complexity of what he'd become had started with something simple, a child's willingness to reach out to something different, to offer friendship without fear. That was the real magic, he understood now. Not the dimensional doors or the galaxy marble or even the Star Bears themselves, but the capacity for connection, for wonder, for love that transcended the boundaries of what should be possible. Jessica often found him looking at that picture, and she would remember that day, the terror and wonder of it, the way her whole understanding of the world had shifted in an instant. She thought about all the mothers throughout history who'd watched their children become something extraordinary, who'd had to let them go into danger and strangeness because that was their path. She was proud of Connor, proud of the young man he was becoming, but part of her still saw that baby reaching out fearlessly to touch the unknown. That was who Connor really was, underneath all the cosmic significance and dimensional responsibilities. He was still that fearless child, still reaching out, still making friends with the impossible. The Star Bears had told them that Connor's generation would be the one to fully open the doors between worlds, to make the extraordinary an accepted part of human existence. Already, the changes were visible. Scientists were discovering things that didn't fit their models. Artists were creating works that seemed to come from somewhere else. Children were being born with abilities that couldn't be explained. The world was evolving, guided by the stories Connor and the other Guardians were protecting and spreading. It would take time, maybe generations, but eventually humanity would remember what it had once known and forgotten. That the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than anyone dared to imagine. Ethan had begun training his successor, a young man named Jacob Bennett, who'd discovered he could see the history of any comic he touched, could experience the stories as if he'd lived them. Jacob would take over the shop someday, would continue the work Ethan had started. But that day was still far off. Ethan wasn't ready to leave yet. Not when there were still so many stories to discover, so many wonders to witness. He'd been an ordinary man running an ordinary shop until that day when everything changed. Now he was part of something legendary, a footnote in a story that spanned dimensions. He couldn't imagine a better fate. The shop had become a pilgrimage site for those who felt the call of the extraordinary. They came from all over the world, drawn by dreams or rumors, or just a feeling they couldn't explain. Most left with a comic and a vague sense that they'd brushed against something special. But some, the ones who were ready, left with much more. They left with their eyes opened, their minds expanded, their hearts connected to the great web of story that held everything together. They became part of the network, spreaders of wonder, keepers of magic in their own communities. The transformation that had started with one lost star bear was spreading across the globe. Unstoppable now, a revolution of imagination. Connor knew that bigger challenges were coming. The star bears had warned him about entities that fed on forgotten stories, that tried to erase wonder from universes. They were drawn to worlds like Earth that were waking up to magic, tried to snuff out the light before it could fully ignite. But Connor wasn't worried. He had his family, both human and otherwise. He had the Guardians, growing in number and power every day. He had the stories themselves, alive and fierce and protective of those who protected them. And he had the promise the Star Bears had made that they would stand with humanity when the time came, that the bonds forged in that comic shop back room were unbreakable. Sometimes Connor wondered what would have happened if he hadn't wandered into that back room. If his mother had kept a tighter grip, if Ethan had fixed the lock. Would the Star Bear have found another way to make contact? Would someone else have become the bridge? But these were idle thoughts. He understood now that some things were meant to happen, that the universe had ways of ensuring its stories got told. He had been chosen before he was born, marked by dreams his mother had during pregnancy, dreams of stars and impossible creatures that she dismissed as hormonal imaginings. Everything had led to that moment, and everything since had flowed from it. The galaxy marble pulsed in his hand as he stood in the shop one evening, watching the sun set through the dusty windows. New children would come tomorrow, drawn by dreams or curiosity or fate. He would show them wonders. Teach them to see the connections, help them find their own roles in the great story. Some would become guardians like him. Others would be artists or scientists or teachers who carried the magic forward in their own ways. All of them would be changed, would become part of the transformation that was slowly but inevitably reshaping the world. Lily called to him from the front of the shop, saying she'd found something interesting in a shipment of old comics that had just arrived. Connor made his way through the familiar aisles, past the displays that held so many memories now. Lily was holding a comic he'd never seen before, one that looked ancient, but also somehow new. On the cover was an image that made his breath catch. It showed him, but older, maybe in his 20s, standing in what looked like the shop, but transformed into something impossible, with walls that opened onto a dozen different worlds. Around him stood not just star bears but beings of every description, creatures of light and shadow, of metal and mist, of concepts that had no physical form, and in his hand he held not just the galaxy marble but something more, something that looked like a key made of condensed stories. The comic's title was The Guardian of Stories, the Final Chapter. But Connor knew instinctively that it wasn't really final. Nothing ever was in the world of stories. Endings were just new beginnings. Last pages just doorways to the next volume. He opened the comic carefully and found that all the pages were blank except for one. On that page was a message, written in the Star Bears language, but somehow also in English, somehow in every language at once. It said, "The story you're living is the story you're writing. Every choice creates a new page. Every connection adds a new chapter. The ending hasn't been written because the story never ends. It just transforms, evolves, becomes something new. You are not just the guardian of stories, Connor. You are a story yourself, one that the universe is telling with joy and wonder. Keep writing, keep reaching out, keep believing in the impossible." Connor smiled, understanding flooding through him. The comic wasn't showing his future, it was showing him that he was creating his future with every choice, every action, every moment of wonder he facilitated. He was both author and character, both reader and story. The Star Bears had given him many gifts, but perhaps the greatest was this understanding, that reality itself was malleable, shaped by the stories people told and believed. And if that was true, then anything was possible. Any ending could be rewritten, any limitation overcome, any dream made real. He showed the comic to Lily, who gasped and immediately began seeing connections he'd missed, threads that led to other stories, other guardians, other worlds. Together, they began to map out the implications, the possibilities. Ethan joined them, then Jessica, then others who'd become part of their strange family. They stood together in the shop as night fell, surrounded by stories, planning their next chapter. The Star Bears were out there somewhere, watching, approving, preparing for the next phase of the grand experiment. The world was changing. One story at a time, one child at a time, one moment of wonder at a time. As the evening deepened into night, Connor felt the familiar tingle that meant the Star Bears were near, not physically but dimensionally, watching through the thin places between worlds. He held up the galaxy marble, and it projected their message into the air, visible to everyone in the shop. It was simple but profound. The door is always open, the story continues. Wonder never dies. The message faded, but its truth remained, embedded in the walls of the shop, in the hearts of those who'd witnessed miracles, in the very fabric of a reality that was learning to dream again. Connor thought about the baby he'd been, reaching out fearlessly to touch something impossible. He thought about the child he'd become, learning to navigate between worlds. He thought about the adult he would grow into, the one shown in that mysterious comic, surrounded by beings from across the universe. But mostly, he thought about right now, this moment, standing in a comic shop that was so much more than a comic shop, surrounded by family that was so much more than family, living a story that was so much more than a story. This was his life, strange and wonderful and absolutely perfect in its impossibility. The shop would close soon, the customers would go home, the lights would dim. But the magic would remain, humming in the walls, alive in the stories, waiting for tomorrow's wonders. Connor would go home with his mother, do homework, eat dinner, be a normal kid for a few hours. But even in those mundane moments, the galaxy marble would pulse in his pocket, reminding him of who he really was, what he was part of. He was Connor Brooks, guardian of stories, friend to Star Bears, bridge between worlds. He was living proof that impossible things happened every day, that magic was real, that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than most people dared to believe. As they prepared to leave the shop for the night, Connor took one last look around. The comics sat quietly on their shelves, but he could see the stories breathing within them, alive and waiting. The back room door stood closed, but he knew it could open at any moment onto wonders beyond description. The self-writing comic continued its work, documenting everything, ensuring that this moment, this magic, would never be forgotten. And somewhere, in the spaces between spaces, the Star Bears continued their eternal work, collecting stories, preserving wonder, connecting worlds through the power of narrative. Connor understood now that his encounter with the Star Bear hadn't been an accident or even a beginning. It had been a continuation of something ancient and vital, a story that had been being told since the universe began, a story about connection and wonder and the power of reaching out to touch the unknown. He was just one character in that vast narrative, but he was an important one, a crucial link in a chain that stretched across dimensions. The baby, who'd wandered into a back room, had become a guardian of something precious, something that couldn't be allowed to die. The world outside the shop continued on, unaware of the miracles happening within its walls. People went about their lives, worried about normal things, dreamed normal dreams. But slowly, inexorably, the magic was spreading. In bedrooms and classrooms, in parks and libraries, children were discovering that they could do impossible things, that they could see beyond the veil of the ordinary. Adults were remembering dreams they'd forgotten, talents they'd suppressed, connections they'd lost. The Star Bear's gift wasn't just to Connor or even to the Guardians. It was to humanity itself, a reminder of what they'd always been capable of, but had forgotten in their rush toward rationality and reason. Jessica watched her son with a mixture of pride and wonder. She'd been an ordinary mother with ordinary expectations until that day when everything changed. Now, she was part of something extraordinary, witness to miracles that most people couldn't imagine. She'd learned to accept the impossible, to embrace the strange, to find joy in the unknown. Connor had taught her that, had shown her that the world was far more magical than she'd ever suspected. She was grateful for that gift, even though it meant her son would never have a normal life, would always be pulled between worlds, would always carry responsibilities no child should have to bear. But Connor didn't seem burdened by his role. If anything, he thrived on it, found joy in every new discovery, every new connection. The Star Bears had chosen well, Jessica realized. They'd found someone who could bear the weight of wonder without being crushed by it, who could navigate between worlds without losing himself. Connor was special, not just because of what he could do, but because of who he was. A child who'd never lost his capacity for joy, for surprise, for love. That was his real power, the thing that made him the perfect guardian. He didn't just protect stories. He lived them, breathed them, became them. As they finally left the shop, Connor looked up at the stars visible between the city buildings. Each one was a sun, possibly warming worlds where other children were meeting their own Star Bears, discovering their own magic, becoming their own guardians. The universe was vast and full of stories, and he was connected to all of them through the network the Star Bears had woven. He was never alone, even when he seemed to be. He was part of something infinite and eternal, something that would continue long after he was gone, carried forward by the children he taught, the stories he protected, the wonder he helped preserve. The Galaxy Marble pulsed one last time as they walked away from the shop, and Connor could have sworn he heard the Star Bears purring across the dimensions, a sound of approval and promise. They would return, he knew, maybe tomorrow, maybe next year, maybe when he was the age shown in that mysterious comic. But they would return, bringing new challenges, new wonders, new chapters in the never-ending story. And he would be ready, along with all the other guardians, all the other children who'd been touched by magic, all the adults who'd remembered how to believe. The story that had begun with a baby wandering into a back room would continue, growing and evolving and transforming with each telling. It would become legend, then myth, then something beyond either, a truth so profound it couldn't be contained in words. But at its heart, it would always be simple. A child reached out to something strange and wonderful, and in that reaching, changed the world. That was the power of stories. Connor understood now. They didn't just describe reality, they created it, shaped it, made it more than it had been before. As they walked home through the quiet streets, Jessica holding Connor's hand like she had when he was truly small, both of them knew that tomorrow would bring new wonders. The shop would open, children would come, stories would be shared, and somewhere in the spaces between spaces, the Star Bears would be watching, waiting, preparing for the next phase of the grand adventure. The door between worlds was open now and could never be fully closed. Magic had returned to the world, one story at a time, one child at a time, one impossible, wonderful moment at a time. And in the comic shop on the corner of 5th and Main, the self-writing comic added one more line before closing itself for the night. To be continued in the dreams of every child who dares to reach for the stars, in the heart of every adult who remembers how to wonder, in the story that never ends because it's always just beginning. The night deepened, the stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere, in dimensions humans couldn't yet perceive, the star bears purred their approval. The guardian of stories slept peacefully, the galaxy marble glowing softly beside his bed, dreams and reality blending into something new, something impossible, something absolutely, wonderfully true. The story continued. As it always had, as it always would, in the space between what is and what could be, in the moment when a child reaches out to touch the unknown and discovers that the unknown has been waiting all along to touch them back.